I was 72 hours into homelessness when I realized my son had thrown away $8 million. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Robert Michael Rodriguez. I'm 67 years old. For 35 years, I woke before dawn to work at a logistics company outside Chicago. Never missed a day. Never complained. I believed loyalty meant something. Turned out it didn't. The Friday they let me go, some kid young enough to be my grandson handed me a cardboard box with old photos and a cracked coffee mug. 35 years reduced to that. I went home, carrying that box like a coffin. The house wasn't mine. It belonged to my son Daniel and his wife Melissa. I'd poured most of my savings into that down payment. In return, I became the man who paid bills, watched grandkids, and kept quiet. When I told him I'd been let go, the silence cut deeper than any words. 3 days later, the worst blizzard in a decade hit Chicago. The temperature dropped to -13. My son walked into my room carrying 2 suitcases and informed me I'd be spending some time away. He'd already called a car to take me to the bus station. Said there were shelters available downtown. I reminded him it was snowing. He told me I'd figure it out. No hug, no apology. I was placed on the curb like broken furniture. I watched the door close, watched the lights go off. The house I'd helped pay for stopped being my home that night. What my son didn't know, what nobody knew, was that my blood was about to make me worth more than he'd earned in 10 lifetimes. And by the time he found out, it would be too late. The signs had been there for months before that Friday, but I'd chosen to ignore them, the way a man ignores a small crack in the foundation until the whole house starts to lean. I'd moved in with Daniel and Melissa 4 years earlier, after my wife Margaret passed. Lung cancer took her in 7 months. We'd been married 41 years. The house we'd shared suddenly felt like a museum of memories I couldn't afford to maintain. When Daniel suggested I sell it and move in with them, it seemed like the right choice. Family taking care of family. I put $300,000 toward their mortgage refinance. Not a loan, a gift. Daniel said it would make everything easier for all of us. Said I'd always have a home. For a while, it worked. I took the small room at the end of the hall, watched my granddaughters after school, fixed things around the house, cooked Sunday dinners, paid a third of all the bills without being asked. But something shifted after the second year. Melissa started making comments about how much space I took up, how her friends thought it was strange having an older person living with them. She'd suggest retirement communities with activities and people my own age. I'd smile and change the subject. Daniel grew distant. He'd come home from his job at the bank and go straight to his office. Our conversations became transactional. He'd ask if I'd paid the electric bill or picked up his dry cleaning. Never asked how I was feeling, never asked about my day at the warehouse. The worst part was how they talked around me, like I was furniture that might repeat what it heard. They'd discuss finances in hushed tones, stop talking when I entered rooms, exchange glances that said things they wouldn't say out loud. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief had made me sensitive, that they were just busy with their own lives. Then came the Friday morning meeting at work. My manager, a 28-year-old with a business degree and no concept of what 3 decades of labor meant, informed me the company was restructuring. They needed someone more adaptable to new technology, someone who fit their evolving culture. I asked if my performance had declined. He said it wasn't about performance, it was about the future. I cleaned out my desk while people I'd trained pretended not to notice. Carried that box to my car and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to tell my son I'd become what he already seemed to think I was, a burden without purpose. When I walked through the door that evening, Daniel was on the couch with his laptop. I set the box down and told him what happened. He looked at me for maybe 3 seconds before returning his attention to the screen. Then he said the words I'd been afraid to hear for months. He said I'd become a problem. Melissa appeared from the kitchen, arms crossed. They'd been counting on my income contribution. They'd made decisions based on that money continuing. Now I was a variable that had changed, and variables like me disrupted carefully balanced equations. I tried explaining I'd find something else, that I just needed a little time. She made a sound that might have been a laugh and suggested I be realistic about my age and prospects. That night, lying in my narrow bed, I heard them arguing through the walls. My name came up multiple times. So did numbers, monthly expenses, the cost of keeping someone who no longer pulled their weight. I'd spent 35 years proving my worth through work. Now, without that work, I had to face the possibility that my worth had always been measured in dollars rather than love. The blizzard was forecast to arrive Saturday morning. I went to sleep hoping things might look different in daylight. They didn't. The storm arrived exactly when they said it would, which I suppose was the only predictable thing about that weekend. I woke Saturday to wind that sounded like something alive trying to get inside the house. Snow hit the windows in waves. The Weather Service was calling it a once-in-a-decade event. Winds up to 60 miles per hour, whiteout conditions, temperatures that could kill an exposed person in minutes. Daniel knocked on my door around 10 in the morning. When I opened it, he was holding both of my suitcases, the old matching set Margaret and I had bought for our honeymoon to Niagara Falls. He informed me I needed to leave, that I'd be staying somewhere else for a while, that he'd already arranged transportation to the downtown bus station. I looked at the window, at the snow coming down so thick I couldn't see the neighbor's house. He told me he understood it wasn't ideal, but they needed space to figure things out, that having me there was putting pressure on their marriage, that I'd understand if I thought about their needs instead of my own. Melissa appeared behind him. She mentioned the municipal shelter on Clark Street, said they had beds and hot meals, said plenty of people managed just fine there. I asked if they were serious. Daniel's face hardened in a way I'd never seen before. He said he was done arguing, that the car would be here in 20 minutes, that I could make this easy or difficult, but the outcome was the same. I packed in silence, clothes, medications, the photo of Margaret I kept by the bed. My hand shook, but not from cold. From the realization that the boy I'd raised, whose diapers I'd changed and whose college I'd paid for, could look at me with such complete absence of feeling. The rideshare driver looked uncomfortable when he arrived. He asked twice if I was sure about going out in this weather. Daniel answered for me, said I had people waiting downtown. The lie came out smooth as practice. We crawled through streets turning invisible under snow. The driver kept the radio on, updates about road closures, warnings to stay indoors, reports of power outages. The shelter was in a converted warehouse, brick walls and fluorescent lights, and the smell of industrial disinfectant barely covering something older and sadder. A woman at the intake desk took my information without judgment. She'd seen plenty of men like me, men who'd worked hard, played by rules, and ended up here anyway. She assigned me a bed in the men's section, number 47, in a room of 60 metal frames. I spent that first night listening to men cough and snore and cry in their sleep. The heating system clanked, but never quite caught up with the cold seeping through old windows. I thought about Daniel sleeping in his warm bed, in the house I'd helped buy, probably not thinking about me at all. Sunday passed in a blur of bad coffee and worse food. I sat in the common area, watching snow pile against windows, wondering how long a man could survive on pride, alone. Monday, the temperature dropped further, minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that killed people every year in this city. The kind that made you understand how thin the line was between having a life and losing one. That's when Dr. Henry Caldwell showed up with his portable lab equipment and his volunteer badge and his offer that seemed too simple to be real. He was doing a research study, he explained, genetic testing for older adults and people experiencing homelessness, looking at hereditary markers, blood types, anomalies that might help medical science understand human variation better. The test was free, took 5 minutes, might help someone down the line. I'd been thrown away already. What did I have to lose? I rolled up my sleeve and let him take 3 vials of blood. He thanked me, said results would take a few days, and moved on to the next bed. I didn't think about it again until Wednesday afternoon, when he came back looking like he'd seen something that scared and amazed him in equal measure. He asked if we could talk privately. That conversation changed everything. Dr. Caldwell led me to a small office, the shelter used for counseling sessions. His hands trembled slightly as he opened his laptop and turned the screen toward me. He asked if I'd ever heard of R.H. Knoll blood. I hadn't. He explained it like a teacher, trying to make complicated science simple for someone who'd spent his life loading trucks instead of reading medical journals. R.H. Knoll was called golden blood, rarest blood type on Earth. Fewer than 50 people worldwide were known to have it. It lacked all 61 antigens in the Rh system, which made it simultaneously precious and dangerous. Precious because it could potentially be given to anyone with rare blood disorders. Dangerous because people who had it could only receive the same type back. I asked why that mattered to me. He pulled up test results filled with numbers and terms I didn't understand. Then he pointed to one line highlighted in yellow and said something I still replay in my mind when I need to believe impossible things can happen. He told me my blood was even rarer than standard Rh null. I carried a specific antibody configuration that appeared in fewer than 10 documented cases globally. This particular combination had shown promise in treating a rare and aggressive form of pediatric leukemia that resisted conventional therapy. I asked him to repeat that. He did, slower this time. Then he explained that a private medical research fund was actively searching for donors with my exact profile. The grandson of the fund's founder was dying from this disease. They'd been looking for 2 years. They'd tested thousands of people across 4 continents. And here I was, bed 47 in a Chicago homeless shelter, carrying the one thing that might save a child's life. The fund was offering $8 million for a controlled donation agreement and lifelong medical monitoring. The money would be mine regardless of treatment outcome, though preliminary studies suggested a strong likelihood of success. I'd need to undergo additional testing, relocate to their facility for the treatment period, and submit to quarterly health assessments for the rest of my life to help them understand how the antibody worked. $8 million. I made him repeat that number 3 times. He assured me it was legitimate, gave me names and phone numbers and documentation that looked more official than anything I'd ever signed, said I should consult a lawyer, think it through, talk to family. I almost laughed at that last part. The family who'd thrown me into a snowstorm didn't need to be consulted about anything anymore. I asked when I could start. He looked surprised. Most people needed time to process. They wanted to verify, to question, to make sure it wasn't a scam or a trap. But I'd already learned the hardest lesson life had to offer. Sometimes the things you think you can count on disappear in a blizzard, and sometimes miracles show up in a homeless shelter asking for 3 vials of blood. I told him I'd spent 67 years being the reliable one, the one who showed up, did the work, kept quiet about it. Maybe that had been practice for this moment. Maybe every early morning and every aching back and every time I swallowed disappointment had been leading here. He scheduled the next round of testing for Friday, said if everything checked out, they'd want to move forward immediately. The child was running out of time. That night, in bed, 47, I didn't sleep. I watched shadows move across the ceiling and thought about probability and purpose and how a man's value can't be measured by the people who stopped seeing him. My blood had always been ordinary. Regular checkups, routine labs, nothing worth noting. Turned out I'd been carrying something extraordinary the whole time. I just needed to lose everything to find out. The second round of testing took 4 days at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. They gave me a private room on the 8th floor with a view of the lake and food that didn't come from industrial-sized cans. Nurses checked on me every few hours. Doctors asked questions about my health history going back decades. Dr. Caldwell visited daily with updates. The antibody profile was confirmed, even more precise than initial testing suggested. The compatibility markers for the child, a 7-year-old boy named Samuel, were near perfect. The medical team was calling it unprecedented. I asked about the family. Caldwell explained that Samuel's grandfather had built a pharmaceutical fortune before retiring to focus on medical research. When his grandson got sick 3 years ago, he'd liquidated assets and created a fund specifically for this purpose. He wasn't looking for publicity or recognition. He just wanted to save one child. I understood that. A man will do things for his grandchildren he wouldn't do for himself. The donation process was explained in detail. They'd take controlled amounts of my blood plasma over several weeks, process it, prepare it for treatment. I'd be monitored constantly, fed specific diets to maintain optimal blood chemistry, given supplements and medications to protect my health during donation. It wasn't dangerous, they assured me, but it was intensive. The legal team arrived on Tuesday. 3 lawyers in expensive suits who treated me like someone important for the first time in my life. They walked me through every clause, every protection, every contingency. The money would be placed in a trust account immediately upon my signature, half released when I completed initial donation, half released 6 months later, if I remained in good health and continued cooperation. $8 million. I signed on Wednesday. Thursday morning, they began the first extraction. I lay in a hospital bed while machines hummed and my blood flowed through tubes into sterile containers. It didn't hurt. Mostly I felt tired, like after a long shift at the warehouse. Between sessions, I had time to think about Daniel, about Melissa, about my granddaughters Emma and Sophie, who I hadn't seen since that Saturday morning, about the house I'd helped buy and the life I'd thought I was building there. I wondered if they'd noticed I was gone, if they'd tried calling, if they felt any guilt at all. The answer came Friday afternoon when the story hit the news. The hospital's PR department had negotiated carefully with Samuel's family. They wanted some publicity, not for glory, but to highlight the importance of rare blood donation and genetic testing. The family agreed to limited coverage. A local news station ran the story, "Homeless Man's Rare Blood Saves Dying Child." They'd interviewed Dr. Caldwell about golden blood and odds-defying medical matches. They'd shown footage of the hospital, the donation equipment, me in my room looking older and thinner than I'd realized. They'd used my full name, Robert Michael Rodriguez. My son had 48 hours before he saw that broadcast. That's how long it took for someone at his bank to mention they'd seen his father on the evening news. Daniel showed up Saturday morning carrying flowers from the hospital gift shop and an expression I recognized from his childhood, the one he'd worn when he broke Margaret's favorite lamp and needed to convince her it was an accident. He pushed into my room talking fast, saying he'd been worried, that he'd tried calling but my phone must have been off, that the timing with the storm had been terrible, that he'd never meant for me to end up in a shelter. The lies came smooth as practice. He'd probably rehearsed them in the parking lot. Melissa followed close behind, wearing heels too expensive for a hospital visit. She went straight to sympathy, talking about how stressful that week had been for everyone, how they'd acted rashly, how family was what mattered most. I let them talk, watched them perform. Daniel kept glancing at the medical equipment, the private room, the cards from the hospital staff, thanking me for my bravery. Finally, he asked the question he'd come for. He wanted to know if the news story was true about the compensation. I told him it was. He tried to hide his reaction, but couldn't quite manage it. His eyes went bright with calculation. Melissa literally stepped closer, like proximity to me might transfer some of that money into her hands. Then Daniel said the thing I'd been waiting to hear, the thing that proved everything I'd suspected about why they'd come. He reminded me he was my son. That blood was thicker than water. That family took care of family. I almost laughed. Blood is thicker than water. He'd thrown that phrase around like it meant something after throwing me into a blizzard because my blood wasn't earning enough anymore. Now my blood was worth $8 million, and suddenly, family mattered again. I didn't argue, didn't explain, just told them I was tired and needed rest. Melissa suggested we could talk about the future once I was feeling better, about maybe investing in a bigger house where we could all live comfortably, about securing my granddaughter's education, about being a family again. Daniel nodded along, already spending money he'd never have access to. They left promising to come back soon, to bring the girls, to make everything right. I watched them go and felt nothing but clarity. That night, I called the lawyers. The legal team arrived Monday morning with documents I'd requested over the weekend. I'd spent Saturday and Sunday thinking about one thing, making sure my son never got $1 of the money he'd shown up to claim, not out of spite, out of truth. Daniel had proven exactly who he was that Saturday morning in the blizzard. Melissa had proven it too. They'd done the calculation and decided I was worth more gone than staying. They'd looked at me and seen a cost instead of a father, a burden instead of the man who'd raised one of them and welcomed the other into our family. Now they were doing new math, and I wasn't interested in pretending $8 million changed anything fundamental about them. The lead attorney was a woman named Patricia Chin. She'd been practicing estate law for 23 years and had the direct manner of someone who'd seen every variation of family greed. She laid out options like a menu. I could put everything in a revocable trust with me as trustee. That gave me control, but made the assets vulnerable to legal challenges. I could create an irrevocable trust with specific instructions that protected the money but limited my flexibility. I could establish foundations, create educational funds, name specific beneficiaries while excluding others. I asked which option would prevent Daniel from accessing anything while still protecting my granddaughters. Patricia smiled, said we could do better than that. We spent 3 days building a structure that would serve two purposes: securing the futures of people who deserved it and making crystal clear that actions had consequences. First, we created 2 educational trusts for Emma and Sophie, each funded with $500,000, accessible only after they turned 25 and completed any form of higher education or vocational training. The trusts would cover tuition, housing, and living expenses during their schooling. After 25, they'd get monthly distributions until 40, when they'd receive the remainder. The kicker: Daniel and Melissa had no access, couldn't touch it, couldn't borrow against it, couldn't convince the girls to share it early. The trustee was an independent firm with instructions to deny any requests that deviated from the plan. Second, we established grants to 3 organizations: the shelter where I'd stayed, Dr. Caldwell's research program, and a fund for older adults experiencing homelessness. $2 million total, distributed over 10 years. Third, I set aside money for my own care, housing, and medical needs. Comfortable, but not excessive. A modest apartment, reliable transportation, quality health care, and enough cushion for emergencies and small pleasures. The rest, about $4 million after taxes and fees, went into a foundation named after Margaret. The Margaret Ann Rodriguez Foundation for Family Reconciliation would fund counseling, mediation, and support services for families struggling with elder care decisions. It would help prevent other men from ending up in bed 47 of a homeless shelter because their children saw them as problems instead of people. Patricia asked if I want to include any provisions for Daniel. I thought about that for a long time. Finally, I told her to include one clause: if Daniel or Melissa contested any part of the estate plan, they'd forfeit any right to future consideration, and the girls' trusts would include provisions explicitly preventing their parents from exerting pressure to access the money. She nodded like I'd just passed some kind of test. We finalized everything Wednesday. I signed page after page while Samuel's treatment continued down the hall. The child was responding well. His blood counts were improving. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Turned out my blood worked better than anyone had hoped. Thursday afternoon, Daniel and Melissa returned with the girls. Emma was 12, Sophie 9. They ran to my bed, excited to see Grandpa in his fancy hospital room. I hugged them hard enough to memorize how it felt. Daniel and Melissa hung back wearing expressions that attempted concern while betraying impatience. They wanted to discuss practical matters, living arrangements, how we'd handle the money, what investments made sense. I told them we'd talk about it soon. Melissa pushed, said soon wasn't specific enough, that decisions needed to be made, that opportunities might pass if we waited too long. I looked at my granddaughters playing with the hospital bed controls and made a choice. I told Daniel and Melissa that I'd made all the decisions already, that everything was handled, that they didn't need to worry about managing anything because they wouldn't be managing anything. The temperature in that room dropped fast. Daniel asked what I meant. I explained that the money was allocated, that trusts and foundations were established, that lawyers had handled everything according to my wishes. Melissa's face went red. She demanded to know if we were included in those wishes. I said Emma and Sophie were provided for generously, that their education and future security were guaranteed. Daniel caught on before she did. He asked, "What about him?" I met his eyes and told him the truth as clearly as I knew how. I said he'd made his choice the morning he put me on a curb in a blizzard, that he'd calculated my value and found it wanting, that now he'd have to live with that calculation. The silence after I spoke lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then Daniel exploded. He shouted that I was being manipulated, that the hospital or the lawyers or someone had gotten into my head, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that family was supposed to stick together and I was violating that bond. Melissa grabbed his arm, trying to quiet him before security came, but her face showed she agreed with every word. She just wanted to be strategic about it. I let him finish, watched him work through rage into bargaining. He reminded me of everything he'd done for me, how he'd taken me in after Margaret died, how he'd shared his home, how this was my chance to show gratitude. The rewriting of history was almost impressive. I asked if he remembered the $300,000 I'd put toward his mortgage. He waved that away, said it wasn't the same as what I had now, that I'd been lucky, and luck was supposed to be shared with blood family. There was that word again, blood. My blood in the machines down the hall keeping a child alive, my blood that had been worthless when it wasn't earning a paycheck, my blood that was suddenly sacred now that it came with a price tag. I told him I'd made my decision, that it was final, that the lawyers had instructions to deny any appeals or requests for reconsideration. Melissa finally spoke. She suggested I didn't understand what I was doing, that older people sometimes needed help with complex financial decisions, that maybe we should talk to my doctor about whether I was competent to make these choices. That's when I understood they weren't just disappointed. They were going to fight. Patricia Chen had warned me this might happen. She'd seen families turn vicious over far less money. She'd suggested I prepare for accusations of diminished capacity, undue influence, or manipulation. She'd told me to document everything, to make sure multiple witnesses saw me making clear, coherent decisions. I'd already done that. The hospital had psychiatrists evaluate me as part of the medical protocol. I'd passed every cognitive test with scores that put me in the healthy range for my age. Those evaluations were dated and signed and stored with the legal documents. Daniel and Melissa could try claiming I wasn't competent, but they'd lose. I told them they should leave, that I was tired and needed rest. Daniel leaned close. Said this wasn't over, that I'd regret cutting out my only son. That blood meant something whether I wanted to admit it or not. I looked at Emma and Sophie watching their father threaten their grandfather and felt sick. But I also felt certain. I told Daniel he was right, that blood meant something. It meant he was genetically my child. But being a son required more than genetics. It required showing up when things were hard, treating people like they mattered, doing right by the man who'd raised you. He'd failed those tests long before that Saturday in the storm. Melissa collected the girls. Emma looked confused. Sophie was starting to cry. They didn't understand why everyone was angry, why Grandpa looked sad, why Mom and Dad were rushing them out. I wanted to explain, to tell them this wasn't their fault, that I loved them and always would, that the trusts I'd created were proof of that love. But they left before I could find the words. The room felt empty after they'd gone. I sat in the quiet, listening to machines beep and hospital sounds filter through the walls, thought about how winning sometimes felt hollow, how doing the right thing didn't always feel good. Patricia called that evening. She'd gotten a message from an attorney representing Daniel and Melissa. They were contesting the estate plan on grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence. I asked how long that would take to resolve. She said probably 6 months, maybe a year if they really pushed, but she wasn't worried. The documentation was solid. The evaluations were recent. Multiple witnesses had interacted with me and could testify to my clarity of thought. Then she said something that helped. She told me cases like this usually fell apart not because of legal problems, but because the people contesting them eventually realized they were proving the testator's point. That by fighting so hard for money they never earned, they were demonstrating exactly why they didn't deserve it. Daniel would figure that out eventually, or he wouldn't. Either way, the outcome was the same. The legal challenge lasted 4 months. During that time, I moved from the hospital to a rehabilitation facility to a furnished apartment on the north side with a lake view and more silence than I'd known in years. Samuel was released from the hospital in March, full remission. His family sent me a card with his picture, a small boy with bright eyes and his whole life ahead of him. They thanked me for my gift, said they'd never forget what I'd done. I put that card on my refrigerator where I could see it every morning. Daniel's lawyers filed motions and depositions. They requested medical records, interviewed hospital staff, tried to find anyone who'd testify I'd been confused or coerced. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Patricia scheduled a mediation session for late April. She explained this was standard procedure, one last attempt to resolve things without a judge. Daniel and Melissa would have the opportunity to present their case directly. I'd have the chance to respond. She asked if I was ready for that conversation. I told her I'd been ready since the moment I signed those papers. The mediation took place in a conference room downtown, neutral territory. A retired judge named Bernard Foster presided. He'd seen 1,000 family disputes and had the weary expression of someone who knew most of them were about money, pretending to be about love. Daniel and Melissa arrived with their attorney, a sharp-looking man in his 40s who specialized in estate litigation. They sat across from me like we were negotiating a business deal instead of discussing the fracture of a family. Judge Foster opened by reminding everyone this was voluntary, that he couldn't force any outcome, that his role was to facilitate conversation and possibly find common ground. Daniel's attorney started. He laid out their position, that I'd been vulnerable when the estate plan was created, that I'd been isolated from family during a medical crisis, that the hospital and legal team had undue influence over my decisions. He presented their proposed solution: void the existing plan, distribute assets more equitably, ensure Daniel received at least 40% as sole surviving child. Patricia responded calmly. She referenced the psychiatric evaluations, the witness statements, the documented timeline showing I'd initiated contact with legal counsel rather than being approached. She noted that Daniel had visited me in the hospital only after seeing the news coverage about compensation. That hit hard. I watched Daniel's face flush. Then Judge Foster asked if I wanted to speak directly to my son. I said yes. The lawyers tensed. Direct conversation was unpredictable. People said things in emotion that complicated legal positions. But I'd been carrying words for months. It was time to release them. I looked at Daniel across that polished table and told him I remembered holding him the day he was born, how small and perfect he'd seemed, how determined I'd been to give him better than I'd had. I worked 2 jobs for 6 years to save for his college, went without so he wouldn't have to, paid for the wedding where he married Melissa, co-signed their first car loan, helped them with the down payment on their house. I'd shown up for every birthday, every graduation, every milestone. Even after Margaret died and the world felt empty, I'd shown up for his children because that's what fathers and grandfathers did. Then I got old, lost my job, became inconvenient, and he'd looked at me and seen something disposable. I told him the estate plan wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. He'd shown me exactly who he was that Saturday morning. I'd simply believed him. The money was going where it would matter, to his daughters when they were old enough to make their own choices, to organizations helping people he'd thrown away, to building something that might prevent other families from breaking this way. Daniel tried to interrupt, but Judge Foster stopped him. I kept talking. I said I'd spent 67 years learning a simple lesson. You can't make someone value you. You can work harder, sacrifice more, give everything you have. But if they don't see you as worth keeping, nothing changes that. I told him I was done trying to earn love from someone who saw me as a transaction. Then I said the thing I'd come to understand during those months alone. I told him I forgave him for putting me out in that storm, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because carrying anger was exhausting, and I'd rather spend whatever years remained building something new than mourning something broken. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it certainly didn't mean pretending consequences shouldn't exist. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Melissa broke first. She said this was emotional manipulation, that I was making them look like monsters when they'd only been trying to handle a difficult situation. I asked if she remembered the moment she suggested I be realistic about my age and prospects, if she recalled mentioning the shelter like it was a reasonable option for someone who'd helped buy her house. She went silent. Daniel's attorney tried to redirect, said we should focus on practical solutions, that family relationships were complex, and maybe we could find a middle path that acknowledged past difficulties while moving forward constructively. Patricia cut him off. She stated clearly that there would be no middle path, that the estate plan stood as written, that if Daniel and Melissa chose to continue legal action, They'd find themselves funding a protracted battle they couldn't win while simultaneously proving every assumption that had gone into excluding them. Judge Foster looked at Daniel and asked if he had anything to say to his father. Daniel stared at the table. Then he spoke, and his words confirmed everything. He said I'd always been difficult, that I'd never understood how stressful it was having me in their house, that he'd done his best, and this was the thanks he got. No apology, no recognition, just justification for everything he'd done. I stood up, told Patricia we were finished here, walked out of that conference room into afternoon sunlight, and felt lighter than I had in years. The legal challenge collapsed 3 weeks later. Daniel and Melissa withdrew their claim after their attorney explained the reality. They were spending money on lawyers to prove they deserved money from someone who'd documented exactly why they didn't deserve it. Patricia called to confirm it was over. She sounded satisfied in the way someone who believes in justice gets when justice actually happens. The trusts for Emma and Sophie were locked and funded. The foundation named after Margaret was operational, taking applications from families trying to stay together through difficult elder care transitions. The shelter where I'd spent those nights in bed 47 got a new heating system and expanded medical services. Dr. Caldwell's research program received funding to continue genetic testing in underserved populations. 3 more people with rare blood markers were identified in the first 6 months. One was already in the process of helping a patient. Samuel turned 8 in June. His family sent pictures of his birthday party, a healthy, happy child who'd been dying and wasn't anymore. My blood in his veins, keeping him alive. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston. Nothing fancy, clean, quiet, lake view on clear days. I bought furniture slowly, picking each piece carefully instead of filling space fast. Learned to cook for one again. Started walking the lakefront path every morning. The medical monitoring continued quarterly. Doctor visits, blood work, detailed assessments of my health. I was part of ongoing research now, contributing to understanding about rare blood types and treatment protocols, making sure the knowledge that had saved one child might save others. The money was more than enough. I lived comfortably without luxury, paid my bills easily, didn't worry about unexpected expenses, put some in careful investments that would grow over time. But mostly, I tried to figure out what 67 years of life had taught me now that I had space to think about it. I learned that people show you who they are when it costs them something to be decent. Daniel had shown me. I'd spent months refusing to see it clearly, making excuses, telling myself family meant blood, meant obligation, meant never giving up. Turned out family meant treating each other like humans who mattered. Blood was just biology. I learned that value isn't calculated in paychecks or productivity, that being 67 and unemployed didn't make me worthless, that I'd been carrying something valuable the whole time. I just needed the right circumstances to discover it. I learned that starting over wasn't just for young people, that you could lose a marriage to cancer, a job to corporate restructuring, a family to their own selfishness, and still build something new from what remained. Emma and Sophie turned 13 and 10. Their trusts sat waiting for them, secure and growing. I sent birthday cards and gifts, got back polite thank you notes written in handwriting I recognized as Melissa's. The girls probably didn't know the full story yet. Someday they would. Someday they'd be old enough to understand that their grandfather had protected them from their parents' choices. I hoped they'd look for me when that day came, but I wouldn't force it. Daniel sent one message 6 months after the mediation, a text that said he hoped I was happy with my decision, that I'd destroyed our family over pride, that I'd regret this someday. I deleted it without responding. On the anniversary of that Saturday morning, I woke to fresh snow. Not a blizzard, just the first real snow of the season, gentle and clean. I made coffee and stood at my window watching it fall. Thought about how different this year was from last. How last year I'd been in bed 47 wondering if I'd survived the winter. How this year I was warm and safe and choosing how to spend every day. I thought about Daniel somewhere in that city, probably not thinking about me at all, probably still justified in his own mind about everything he'd done, probably telling himself the story where he was the victim and I was the difficult old man who'd punished him unfairly. People believed what they needed to believe. I'd stopped trying to change that. Instead, I focused on what I could control: my health, my choices, the foundation doing work Margaret would have been proud of, the children whose lives might be saved by research funded partially with my blood, my money, my decision to turn something terrible into something useful. I was 67 years old. Maybe I had 10 good years left, maybe 20, maybe 5. However many I got, they'd be mine, chosen, built on foundations I set, according to values I held, in the company of people who treated me like someone worth knowing. That Saturday morning in the blizzard, my son thought he was throwing away a problem. He was actually throwing away the last chance I'd have given him to be the person I'd raised him to be. Some mistakes you can fix, some you can't. I'd learned to tell the difference. The snow kept falling. I finished my coffee and started planning my day. There was a support group for older adults at the community center I'd been thinking about joining. Not because I needed support, though everyone needs that sometimes, because I had something to offer people going through what I'd survived: experience, perspective, proof that losing everything didn't mean the end. Sometimes it meant the beginning of something truer. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the snow, walked with my head up, breathed cold air that hurt in a good way, felt grateful for warm clothes and working legs and a clear mind and golden blood and second chances earned through nothing more than surviving long enough to get them. My son had calculated wrong that morning. He'd thought he was subtracting a burden. Turned out he was dividing his inheritance by 0. And that's a math error you can't ever fix. I just hoped Emma and Sophie learned better arithmetic than their father had. The rest was up to them. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. There are more true stories like this coming your way. Sometimes family isn't about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when the temperature drops below 0.